Hello, my name is Paul Zanazanian, and welcome to History in the Now Conversations, a podcast on history and how we use it in our everyday lives. History in the Now Conversations explores how we use history to know who we are, to know how to think and feel, and to know how to engage in our daily routines. History in the Now Conversations examines what history is, what it does, and how we can use it or even should use it in our everyday lives. Today's guest is Joseph Levitan, an associate professor in the Department of Integrated Studies in Education at McGill University, who does community-based research, usually with indigenous communities, such as the Quechua in Peru, to help them address challenges that such communities, marginalized communities, face regarding education and their overall development in a positive and productive manner. Hello, Joe. Welcome. Thanks for coming today.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me on.
So what is it that you actually do? I know it's a lot more complicated than what I just spelled out, and I'd love to hear it from you.
What I do is I use community-based participatory action research. And generally what happens is, and this happened accidentally, but it also was an invitation that was very important for me, and kind of what I oriented myself around was I was invited to Peru because a good friend of mine and former roommate had a goddaughter in a Quechua-speaking community, and he wanted to support her to go to school because there were no schools close by. She was able to finish primary school, but secondary schools were in larger towns, and that was a 4-hour walk, and there was no other transportation opportunities. And so without knowing it, I started to engage in community-based participatory action research because as somebody who tries to know what they don't know, I realized that I didn't have any particular expertise in this area. I didn't know what I was getting into, so I had to learn with the community. And so my orientation was very much around how do we learn together about addressing challenges, and how can I mobilize my positionality, how can I mobilize whatever connections I have, whatever power I have to achieve the goals of the community. In this case, it was a rural community in the Peruvian Andes that spoke Quechua. And so we talked to parents, we built consensus, and I didn't know that this was something that there was a research methodology for at the time. I was, in my 20s and teaching in an urban middle school in Baltimore City. But through this process, we realized that one, there are a lot of people who go into areas like this, and instead of thinking about how to collaborate, they think about trying to help. Or instead of thinking about how to learn together, they think about trying to teach. And in the process of learning together, that means you exchange ideas rather than imposing ideas. It doesn't mean that you hide who you are. It means that you are who you are and you share it, but that doesn't mean that it drowns out or silences other people. So everybody is able to really engage in this work together and to build consensus, which means that everybody is okay, can live with the decision. That doesn't mean everybody's 100% happy, but that everybody's like, yes, we can move forward. And that's important because one of the things that I learned, because this doesn't happen all the time in North America, is that consensus is something where people are willing to say, okay, here's the core value, and then how do we match, and how do we give up? Everybody's going to give up something, but we're all going to be okay with that. We're going to move forward because we know this is the thing to do for all the different interests, not just advocating for one's own interest. So that's really the work that I engage in, and I've never gone into a place where I haven't been invited, because that's not really my jam. I really just want to make sure that it's based on relationships, it's based on friendships, it's based on mutual respect, and never imposing anything.
So what really drives you to do this work?
Growing up in Baltimore City, and when we're talking about history, and we're talking about history in the now, I feel like this is really important because that's, your past, your experiences, how you interpret your past and your history is what informs and drives this work for me. I grew up in Baltimore City, which is a kind of working class town, post-industrial. My great-grandfather was in the steel mill, and my grandfather was a vet, and I have family who are union organizers. Like, it's a very blue-collar family, but it's upwardly mobile. Every generation has done better. And so now, even though I have this consciousness, this historical consciousness of being a working class family who, my mom learned how to hide her accent because she wanted to be able to move forward professionally. That consciousness sits within me. And what I noticed in my family, because it's a very tight-knit family, is that hard work together leads to success. And there's a kind of a grittiness to just like, it might not be fun, it might not be pleasant, but you do it because you need to do it because it's for you and it's for your family and it's for the other people in your community. And then I went to university and we studied philosophy. So there's a very different kind of understanding of a lot of this stuff, and I started to learn different philosophies. You read, I did mostly analytic philosophy, but you start to read like Nietzsche, but then I started to read and Kierkegaard, but then I also did analytic philosophy, Saul Kripke and metaphysics and all these kind of British, like the social contract theories and utilitarianism and all of this ideas of ethics. And all of a sudden this whole different kind of world or history opened up. And then I started to learn a little bit about post-colonial theory and post-colonialism and started to recognize like how the world's structures and systems in the fight for power and the different power structures affect the lives of people. I also was exposed to as a young person, but also growing up, issues of addiction, issues of mental health crises, issues of social-emotional challenges because of these things, because I had a diverse group of friends and some friends and family members struggled with addiction, for example, because of living in precarious positions and also because of historical traumas and intergenerational trauma. So because they were close to me and because I had this more collectivist upbringing where everybody mattered, that really drove me. And so whoever is in that community to me, if it's my friend who was a roommate in college who's goddaughter, that's somebody in a community. So then there's a kind of a ethical responsibility when somebody asks with a request you can actually support to do that. And that's what drives the work.
So history, in a way, drives your
History
work.
absolutely drives my work.
So would it be fair to say that before you started university, you had more of an experiential understanding of history, where the historical knowledge that you gained or possessed was based on your lived experiences, the experiences of your ancestors, your family, your immediate family, the history that you would use to navigate your everyday world emerged from those lived experiences. But then when you went to university and you studied philosophy and post-colonial theory, would you say that your approach would maybe be more ideological now? Like, do you see history as something that is emancipatory, or are you able to take critical distance from the way you see the world, or are you more like the message is more important than nuance when using history to engage with the world?
I agree with you that no, the critical distance is super important and the experiential, and the message is not the goal. The goal is the lived experience, and to transform lived experiences in community to make them better. Not necessarily because of some message or because I have some kind of ideology, because in fact, community-based work is explicitly not ideological. Because if you're an ideologue, then you're not working in community because you're not able to change or negotiate or adapt. And if you can't change and negotiate and adapt in a community space to make a collaborative decision, then you're doing that exact ideologue and you're becoming pretty much what the post-colonial, anti-colonial work criticizes, which is an atomistic, individualistic person who mobilizes their power to affect other people.
What is your earliest memory of your connection to history?
That's a good question. I think, so I don't know about the earliest memory. I know that, when I talked to my grandparents and they would tell me about how things were, that was probably one of the most memorable times that I had in terms of a connection to history. So, my grandfather served in the Korean War. He was drafted. And, he'd talk about being on the ship to Japan because he was stationed in Japan and he was on ski patrol. Fortunately, he didn't have to go into combat. But thinking about, he was telling me about this time that for me at, 5, 6 years old was something very formative in his life. And is one of the reasons why I exist, because after he got back, he married my grandmother and, was able to live in Baltimore. And yet it felt so distant, and yet it was such a deep connection to something that was formative for me.
And do you have a memory of a time where you felt connected to history, but time stood still in a way, where you weren't necessarily traveling back in the past or imagining prior times, but actually thinking about history, but feeling in the now zone of the present moment?
Well, I think that that's every moment, every day, to be honest. I mean, you mentioned that I work with Quechua-speaking community members. The past of colonialism lives on today, for example, and you can see it and you can feel it in the now. I feel that my history, just, for example, my reactions to certain things that happened in this moment, if I reflect on it, I can see the tracing back for what those reactions were. And when I see that and when I recognize it, it gives me some space to be able to make different decisions because I know where it came from.
I want you to think and to reflect on a moment in time in the past, or an incident, an episode in your professional life, or even in your everyday life with your family, where you had to justify the importance of using history to attain a certain goal, be it a goal that you wanted to attain to make some change, positive change, or not. And then how would you justify your use of history?
There's a lot that come to mind, but I think one that's really, to me, the way in which narratives of history, because, there's a difference. And I know for those people who study history, this is kind of a superficial difference, but the difference between the past is things that happen in history is our interpretations of the past. But I still think some of that is important to think about, because in the moment that first came to mind, one of the things that I do in my work is I try to mobilize resources, which means I have to go to governments, I have to go to businesses to look for donations for funds for the community, and I have to convince people who come from very different paradigms that the work that's happening in communities is worth spending money on. And that takes a lot of different kinds of thoughtful messaging and understanding the history of the conflicts between kind of, in the case of Peru, Lima, and the kind of upper middle class, and the way that the Quechua community has been marginalized over time, and also the history of uprisings and the history of colonization and the history of the particular kind of colonization that the Spaniards did, and how that created this different tiered system, and the hacienda system in Peru, which has its own history. So there's all kinds of history that lives in Peru and that people hold as part of their identity, and it also that people experience as intergenerational trauma. And there's also inherited biases, and there's also inherited bigotry from people who think of themselves as more advanced than their ancestors, but still hold on to some of these very deeply, without recognizing it often, these deeply held biases about the intelligence, for example, or the know-how, or the responsibility of certain groups of people. And so pulling history to tailor the message to say, hey, here's this group that's trying to do this kind of work. So we try to create culturally grounded education, for example. Getting funding for culturally grounded education when Lima is looking towards the United States and Europe for educational advice is going in the opposite direction. So how do you convince people that actually the culture of the community and their history is where you need to start? And so what we ended up doing is using their history and recognizing the narrative of the past as there's kind of like different stereotypes of the Quechua community, and pulling from the positive ones to show them, let's be more nuanced than the negative ones that they were pointing out. And then also just getting out of that ideology. So trying to show like this whole space is more complex than your narrative, your historical narrative that you're living right now in your interpretation of what I'm saying is actually, the reality is much more nuanced than that. It's much more complex than that. And it's important to recognize that nuance and complexity. And now let's talk about why that should be happening for students as well, so that they can understand their complexity, that they can feel good about their identities. And it should also help with the strategic objectives for the country, such as better learning outcomes, such as increased participation in democratic practices, because now students are going to feel able to say, like, here's who I am, here's what my values are, and here's how I'm going to work in my community. Bridging those gaps requires an historical analysis and understanding where people are coming from all the time, because you need to tailor the message. Some people, it's very easy when we have governors who are Quechua speakers. It's like, hey, we want to do this. And they're like, yes. You don't have to explain anything because they have the history. They share a history. And so you don't have to go into all this detail because you know exactly what the community said. They want this. Here's a letter from the Junta Directiva. Can we do this? And if they're Quechua speaker, 99 times out of 100, they're like, absolutely, especially if I don't have to pay for it as the governor. And so those are kinds of things where history always informs how people think, how people feel, how to communicate, and how to connect.
That's very interesting. You use history in a way in which it can foster reflexive thinking among people, but sometimes it can also serve as an invisible bridge where once you meet someone, there's a synergy that seems to arise and you both understand each other and you don't need to go into the detail.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And even thinking about it as specifically as there's some shared jargon or shared slang terms that you use with people, and you're like, hey, I'm signifying to you that I know some of your history so we can talk. And that's super helpful because it's not just me trying to impose the community's ideas onto this person, but it's also a negotiation and it's also a conversation with two people who have agency. So when I can say we don't need to over explain or be too careful because now we know that we come from some kind of shared understanding, that's super helpful too.
So those cues you just talked about, was that something that took you time to learn as an American going into Peru?
Yeah, it took 5, 6, 7 years to really learn the cues, how to use them properly, the cultural context, the affect that's supposed to go with them, the historical background for how it works, the way in which, as a gringuito, as they say, I can use that in a way that's not appropriating and not holding on to it as my identity, but as a signifier of, I know people here, I know the community, I know the land, I am here. Like, I'm present, I'm an outsider, but I'm not a complete outsider. And so we have shared knowledge together. And I use different Quechua words like Ayanchu. And then when the community speaks in Quechua back and I can have a couple words and I say, but I don't speak a lot, but I can speak a little bit. It's like, okay, you're okay. Like, you're not just some guy doing whatever. You're taking your time to understand our history, our culture, and you're not appropriating it. You're not dressing in inappropriate ways. You're not using it in a way that's trying to take on that identity. I'm very clear in who I am and my identity coming from Baltimore, but it's a matter of sharing knowledge and sharing information and communicating.
So through this work of trust that takes time to develop, you gain a certain level of legitimacy in the eyes of the people you're working with.
Yeah, and knowing the history is super important to that. It's not just, oh, look at this community here and I'm trying to analyze it. It's like, oh, how did the community get here? How did I get here? And knowing my own history and knowing what motivates me, as well as knowing what motivates other people and how they got there and what is going on with the history. So there's a empathy that gets built too.
It's very interesting. Just by listening to what you have to say with the beginnings of your research in Peru, trying to help a friend, and then like leading to this broader engagement with the community at large. You've explained in many ways what history does, and you did offer a brief definition earlier. You referred to it as the interpretation of the past. I was wondering, based on what you said, how would you define history?
I think history is a broad term that obviously can be defined in a variety of different ways. I like to make the distinction between history and the past because I think history as narrative, history as lived reality, history as the ways in which things that have happened before this moment live in this moment is really powerful. And having the past as the past and having history as a selection of the past coming in to continue to live in this moment is really helpful. Me opening a door 2 minutes ago probably isn't going to be something that's lived in the history of my conscious experience. But my interaction 3 days ago or 2 days ago with somebody sharing some idea might be living now. And that extends to 5 years ago, to 10 years ago, to 100 years ago, when my family was in Russia or Germany and fleeing from various oppressors, roughly a little bit less than 100 years ago.
So history for you is something that is alive, even though you refer to the past. Many things can happen in the past, but if they are significant for you in the here and now, they're still alive in a way. So it's like ongoing.
It's ongoing. The things that have had an impression. Some things have an impression that lasts for generations, and some things have an impression that lasts for a second. And so it's a kind of an internal impression, but it's an impression nonetheless.
Earlier, you talked about the workings of history at an individual level, how it affects you, but then you also touched upon history at a group level. Do you have any insights based on what you've just said on how to differentiate between history as exercised or actualized at an individual level versus history as exercised or actualized at a collective level? Or are they both the same?
They are not both the same. This gets into some of the identity work that I think is really important, and some of the stuff that I've been thinking about too and writing about in terms of identity. We all have, and this is one definition of many different theories, but this is the theory that I feel like has been the most helpful for me. It's called pragmatic identity theory, which is looking at the different kinds of identities that we have. So we have multiple identities, and we also have multiple kinds of identities. So we have role identities. My role as associate professor requires me to take on certain tasks and do certain things and take on a certain identity. My role as a brother or a son or a cousin, or a, spouse or whatever, those are all different roles that require different commitments, different responsibilities, and have certain advantages and disadvantages in terms of my own understanding, but also in terms of how the community sees me and their expectations for me. Everything in our lives, in my understanding, is interconnected. So we are individuals, but we're also, just as the air we breathe, the fact that we couldn't survive without the earth because we are inherently organically connected to it. The same thing is true for the communities that we live in. So all of the identities that we take on are both individually and group communally situated. So we have our individual identities that are kind of our interpretations of what our identity is. The fact that I am a man, for example, and that's my, how I see myself and what that takes on in terms of how I should act, what my values are. Being a man doesn't determine all of the values that I have. And in fact, I can have values that go against traditional forms of masculinity, even though those might have had some past input on how I think about it. So I can reject or accept those different components. And in a community, my rejection or acceptance of those, what traditional forms of masculinity are going to affect my relationships. So all of the things that happen to me happen in community, and all the things that I do affect others that happen in community. When history is mobilized in community, there's often a shared understanding of different concepts, different experiences, different ways of being, different ways of thinking, different ways of knowing. And when we share some of those, it determines and affects our interpersonal dynamics. It affects how we understand each other, and it also affects our expectations of each other. What's appropriate, what's inappropriate, what is a funny joke versus something that is not funny for whatever reason. And so communal history affects my attitudes towards different things. When we think about the history of kind of wrongs and traumas and all of this, and that creates division, getting some reflective distance on that to understand what that is and who exactly were the perpetrators of that and who are now the inheritors of that, where it may not be, for example, our fault, but it's our responsibility, and how to take on that. All of that stuff is part of collective consciousness and history. I mean, because that's like when you talk about fault, that's something that happened in the past that becomes history and then becomes, okay, who's at fault? Who needs to do what to make something right? So history is just everywhere. I mean, it lives in our collective consciousness, how we communicate, and also ourselves and how we interpret ourselves. and what we want to accept about ourselves, or what we want to change about ourselves, or what we want to reject about ourselves.
You've offered a very nuanced and detailed understanding of history, which is great. And you tend to see the positive sides of history and how historical knowledge can be used. I was wondering if there are any negatives, or can history have a bad side?
Absolutely. I tend to go right now towards the positive because I'm a bit of a reactionary and I feel like things are very negative right now. So that's why I tend to go positive, because I think that I like to work against the grain of kind of where certain zeitgeists are moving. When things are overly Pollyanna and kind of positive, I may be negative, but vice versa. That's just a historical fact about me. History has a lot of dark sides to it. People use history to mobilize oppression, to mobilize war. Ukraine is an example of that. I mean, there's a historical Soviet Union that no longer exists that a leader has wanted to try to reinstate because of their conceptualization of what should be in their country. And now they're trying to expand that into being a past glory that no longer exists. There's a very dark side to it. I think that history is like a hammer. History is a way of thinking, a way of being that has no more moral valence. The people who live that history, who work that history, who use that history for their own ends, that's where the moral valence is. So historical consciousness, you can use a car to drive. You can also use a car to harm people. You can use a hammer to do the same thing. There are lots of tools that we have, both epistemologically, ontologically, well, not both, epistemologically, ontologically, axiologically, and practically, that can be used for various ends. So I would say, just like a concept like leadership, like you can have good leaders and you can have bad leaders, and everywhere in between. A concept like history has no moral valence. It's the people who use that and mobilize it have the moral valence. The dark side is really in us. And so we decide whether we do the dark side of it or we do the positive side of it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm curious to hear more, because I like to believe that people ultimately use history to restore a sense of integrity or dignity regarding life happenstances that disrupt the regular flow of what they're doing. So if one leader uses history to restore the prior greatness of a nation, then that person's probably trying to restore a sense of integrity or dignity, or to feel complete or fulfilled as an individual. So sometimes there's like a certain clash because other people may not feel that that person's on the right track. So that becomes ideological maybe. But your notion of deliberation earlier, which is what you do through your work, could perhaps play a role.
Yeah, and I think a really deep understanding of ethics and morals is really important here too, right? And it gets into like really complicated concepts. But I think one of the things that's really, to me, kind of a rule of thumb or heuristic in terms of morals is, can I do something that is of benefit to me and benefit to others? Can I do something that is not of benefit to me but of benefit to others? Or can I do something that's benefit to me or not a benefit to others? And when we talk about history, so it was one of the things that you were thinking about, and it's more complicated than that, but I think it's a useful heuristic. If somebody wants to restore a sense of dignity and balance, but their sense of dignity and balance is the murder or the oppression of others, then that is an immoral use of history. That doesn't mean that their initial impulse isn't to restore dignity and balance, but dignity and balance to them can be completely unethical or immoral. And so, I think what you said was exactly right in terms of the impulse for using history to restore a sense of dignity or balance it seems real to me. It's like if I'm feeling down, I can remember times where things went well, or if things are going poorly in one realm of my life, I can think about another facet of my life historically that lives today that makes me feel better. That kind of reasoning makes sense to me. That kind of impulse as a person makes sense to me too, in terms of us trying to feel a sense of well-being. And then when it comes to liberation, I think if we're thinking through how do we work towards the good of both myself and the collective, that is much more helpful. And when that happens, and this is why it gets more complicated, like giving up little things for the greater good, or the greater good giving up little things to support one person, those can be little things. It's not just all or nothing, right? There's a lot of nuance between those three. And how do you navigate that is really where thinking is necessary. Liberation of understanding history and the historical concepts when it comes to identity, and identity to me is lived history, especially once you are a 18-year-old, let's say, or a teenager, but like somebody who has enough history to now have absorbed those family narratives, absorbed the family history, absorbed the cultural history, absorbed the friend circle history, absorbed the whatever identities they want to take on history, then your identities are a lived history. When you can liberate yourself from saying that this history has to be me, and now I can critically understand what that history is in me and my identities, and whether my identities are in coherence or not. That, I think, is really liberating for, one, having a sense of well-being and pride in your history, while also recognizing that your history may not be great in all aspects. Not you personally, like your own actions, but, I come from a Jewish, Russian, and Catholic German background. Pretty complicated when it comes to history. Both of the family members, both sides of my family I care about very deeply and love very much. And none of them, of the living or anybody I've met, had ever perpetrated anything. But that doesn't mean that other people tangential with my last name from one side or the other have done something that would be problematic. And that's a last name that's shared. So when we're talking about liberating that and understanding the nuance of that, that can be really, really helpful, because these are the things that allow us to feel sense of self and well-being in ourselves, while also recognizing that there are things to work on. And and the work that I do when it comes to education is to allow students to have that sense of self and identity that feels right. That is right for, we have important assets, we have important value, we have important things to contribute, not only to our own well-being, but to the greater well-being. And having that sense of that living in your life has shown, empirically, but also philosophically, to have so many important benefits, because it gives meaning, it gives value, it allows you to push through when things are difficult, it gives you a sense of community. These are all components that I think are super important when we talk about history and liberation and education.
Very good. Thank you, Joe. Are there any final thoughts you'd like to share? Is there something that's lingering on your mind and that you'd like to express again or add on?
Not at the moment. Nothing comes to mind, but I appreciate the forum to talk about these things. I think this podcast is really great to think about how living history and history in the now can be useful for us as individuals and as a collective to understand our realities.
Thank you, Joe. That was really good.
You're welcome.
We'll talk soon.
All right. Sounds good.